Okay, here's part two. Not too many more slides left, so it'll only take a couple minutes, but I did want to go over it. So, the other half of chapter 9 talks about government regulatory measures, and we were just talking about monopolies, and so the government tries to prevent monopolies from forming, and so there's various types of regulations, and your book talks a little bit more in detail about these if I'm not covering it enough for you. But basically, monopolies and imperfect competition um, are not a good deal for consumers. The best deal for consumers is always purely competitive market. Gives consumers the best products for the cheapest prices. So how does the federal government control or regulate monopolies? Um, well, one way that's been done historically is we have laws, and those laws are called antitrust laws. And basically, they're anti-monopoly laws to prevent the formation of monopolies. Talk about that a little more in a minute. And then we have price ceilings, because remember, monopolies, they don't have any control on prices because they're a unique producer of a product. They can raise their price as high as they want. And so the federal government can come in and put in a price ceiling, and that stops prices from, going through the roof. A good example of that is the EpiPen. Was in the news a couple months ago about the price of the EpiPen was skyrocketing, and that's because there was a monopoly. And there was only one manufacturer, and people wanted the federal government to come in and put a price ceiling on that. The federal government can charge a lump sum tax on monopolies. And the other thing they can do, which is probably the more important and more common, is one way that monopolies or oligopolists become monopolies is by dropping their prices so low that the competition goes out of business. So the federal government can put in a price floor. And this happened with Walmart it's been quite a few years ago, but Walmart in their pharmacies, they would have very low cost, pharmaceutical prices. It was like a $4 prescription. And the Federal Trade Commission came in and said that is illegal. And Walmart had to at least charge the cost of the prescription. They could charge a low cost, but it had to be the cost of the prescription because they were putting local pharmacies out of business. So that's a minimum price floor. So all of these things are regulated by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. So here's some legislative acts, and I don't know how much of a history buff you want to be. Your book doesn't go into a huge amount of detail, just a little bit of detail. The most important one of these is the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is amazing because it was passed into law in 1890. And even today, there are companies that we're very familiar with, Microsoft being a good one, Bill Gates in particular, has been involved in many antitrust lawsuits, and he has basically been charged with violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. So you can look up more on that if you want. So that is the most important antitrust act. So kind of in summary, you have markets. Basically, in a selling market, you have a good diagram here is purely competitive markets or perfect competition has the least amount of influence over market price. Remember, in pure competition, price is determined by supply and demand. We've been studying that quite a bit. The more you differentiate your product, reduce your competition so there's fewer competitors or the only competitor, then you have more and more influence over the market and more influence over price. So that goes with a monopoly having a single competitor all the way to pure competition, which has many small producers. So that's on the selling side. On the buying side, I didn't talk too much of it. It's a little bit different terminology, but it's the same concept. So the terminology differs because it's now called a monopsony, an oligopsony, or monopsonistic competition. And that's just on the buying market. So for example, we talk about selling products a lot, and a monopoly has the only product that they sell, for example, the EpiPen example. But buying markets are the same way. They have monopolies. A good example of a buying market is when you have a creamery that buys milk from dairies. That is a buying market. So that would fit into that monopsonistic or oligopsony terminology. It's just terminology. I didn't focus too much on this chapter, on this part in the chapter. It is just terms. So in summary, unlike perfect competition, imperfect competitors have the ability to influence price. And that is why I said, like, dairies might decide to have a cheese plant, or they might decide to bottle their own milk because they are tired of being a price taker. They want to control some of the share of the market and maybe make a little more profit. Monopolistic competitors try to differentiate their product. Those are the ones that are very close to being a competitive market. They differentiate their product by advertising, by having brand names. That's monopolistic competitors. Monopolies or monopolists are the only seller in the marketplace. Monopsonists are the only buyer. Oligopolies, you have a few sellers, and usually that is the mergers of those is regulated by the Federal Trade Commission. And then basically they want you to understand that the economic welfare basically has to do with welfare of the people is greatest when you have competition, because competition keeps prices low. So having laws that regulate monopolies benefits the general public overall and enhances economic welfare. And I think that's the last slide. It is. Alrighty, that's all for this one. Okay.